It's such a pleasure for me to be able to introduce Gwen Carr tonight and all of Oregon Black Pioneers. The honor that it is for the Oregon Historical Society to be able to host this exhibit really cannot be overstated. It's an outstanding exhibit that tells a history that so many Oregonians are unaware of, and it tells it beautifully and with so much depth and character and stories and photographs and artifacts, and you really have to come see it again and again. And so I want to recognize Willie Richardson, who's here and is the current president of Oregon Black Pioneers. And I hope Gwen will talk a little bit about Oregon Black Pioneers, but just so you know, there are brochures on the back table that tell about the All Aboard exhibit and tell a little bit about Oregon Black Pioneers. They're an organization that's been around for some years and are working towards even bigger and greater things, and you should know about their work. One of the things that they have done through the fantastic work of Kimberly Moreland, who's also here tonight, and has authored a new book. There we go. This book, African Americans of Portland, it's a book by Oregon Black Pioneers and Kimberly Moreland. It's for sale on the black table. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Senator Avell Gordley's book, Remembering the Power of Words, is also for sale on the back table. So if you haven't read them yet, now is your opportunity. Okay, finally, I will stop and introduce tonight's speaker, Gwen Carr. And Gwen then is going to introduce our two other speakers. So Gwen Carr is the Vice President of Oregon Black Pioneers. She's the chair of the Research and Education Committee. She actually grew up in Los Angeles, California, and came to Oregon in 1980. She retired from her work several years ago as an information systems project manager for SAFE and has since dedicated her time to volunteering to preserve and educate the public about African American history in Oregon. She was the principal researcher and writer for the book Perseverance, A History of African Americans in Marion and Polk County, which is also on the back table and also published by Oregon Black Pioneers. And she was the curator for the fantastic exhibit All Aboard. So please join me in welcoming Gwen Carr.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It's really good to see such a great crowd of interested people so that we can continue to tell the story of African Americans in Oregon. As Vice President of the Oregon Black Pioneers, I want to tell you a little bit about our organization before I get to All Aboard, the exhibit that we want to talk more in detail about. Eliza mentioned that we had been around for a while. And to tell you the truth, I wasn't there at the very beginning, but just lately I was kind of doing a little math and I realized that this is our 20th year. And we're very proud of that. During that time, we have really worked toward our mission, which is to do research and then commemorate the development of Oregon as it relates to African Americans and our involvement in that development. It's been a real learning experience for me because, as she mentioned, I wasn't born here. I didn't study here. I came here in 1980, about a week after Mount St. Helens blew. Now, I don't know whether that's good news or bad news or if that tells you anything about me, but I remember telling people that I was moving to Oregon and they said, "What? They have volcanoes there." And they're alive. They go off. Don't you know any better? But I've always been the type of person, I kind of have my own head and I decided to do something, and I had decided I wanted to move to Oregon, and so I've been here ever since, and I haven't regretted it for a moment. I want to introduce a couple of other people that have not already been introduced, and you need to know who they are because in putting together this exhibit, we pulled together a group of community people, local people, to help us create the vision of what would be involved in this exhibit. And so I'd just like to have them to stand and maybe just give a wave. One is Michael Chappie Grice, who's here. Another is Jackie Peterson Loomis. Jackie is here somewhere. Thank you. One thing that's been interesting to me since my coming to Oregon is that I realized how little I knew about Oregon's Black history. And one of the things I quickly learned was that most people believed that Oregon's Black history began with the shipyards in the 1940s. Now, when you mention the railroads, people will say, oh yeah, that too. But what they don't realize is that the history of African Americans in Oregon goes back all the way to the 1700s. In fact, the earliest documented account of a Black being in Oregon was 1788 in Tillamook Bay, which is, of course, a surprise to most people. Not only that, but of course, a lot of people know about York, who was a part of the Discovery Expedition, which came in the early 1800s. But when you move along and you find that there have been Blacks in Oregon all during that time in various parts all across the state. In fact, of the 36 counties, to this point, we have located the presence of Blacks, particularly in the mid-1800s, all over the state in 31 of those 36 counties. So that's usually a surprise to people as well. Our organization has done research and exhibits and presentations all over the state. We've been in Salem, in Portland, in Bend, in Coos Bay, and it never fails that wherever we go, we're able to pick up on yet another piece of history that we weren't aware of prior to that time. And so I would encourage each of you as you leave here and think about your family's diaries, what you know in terms of African Americans in Oregon. Please be in touch with us because we are constantly in a state of review and research, and we want to know more, and we want to be able to tell more about what's going on. We've been able to work with historians and historical societies, museums from all over the state, with colleges. We have done presentations at schools, for civic organizations, for all sorts of clubs, spreading the word about African Americans in Oregon. And so that's kind of what brought us to where we are in terms of the exhibit that's at the Oregon Historical Society right now. Some of you might remember that we were actually there in 2011 for the first time with an exhibit called Perseverance. And it told the story of those Blacks across Oregon in those early days. And again, it was a triumph and really a surprise for most people to note the people and the places and the things that we were teaching at that time. For the 2013 focus, we decided to focus in on that period of time that had the largest, or the first and largest influx of Blacks into Oregon, and that was in the late 1890s to about 1940. We decided to stop right there and kind of hold that 1940 forward for the next exhibit. And by the way, put it on your calendars because we will be back at the Oregon Historical Society in 2015. And we will tell the story there of the shipyards of Vanport and the resettlements that occurred after that. So it's really our honor and our pleasure to be able to tell these stories, to listen to the stories, and you'll hear some of those tonight. And so before I introduce our other panel members, though, I thought I would give you just a little taste of the exhibit, some of the pictures from that exhibit, as I tell you a little bit about the scope of that exhibit. Let's see. So, Eliza, are we ready? Okay. The exhibit is really kind of in two parts. The first part really helps you to become familiar with the types of jobs that Blacks had along the railroad and how the railroads first brought Blacks into Oregon as a part of the whole transcontinental railroad. How are we doing?
Doing great.
Okay, nothing up there yet. I can talk all night, so we're okay. You might remember that first transcontinental railroad came into Oregon in the late 1800s. Now, to put this in historical perspective, I guess, you have to understand that the Civil War had only been over about 30 or 40 years then. And so the role of blacks at that time on the railroads were largely servant-type roles, because those were the kinds of roles that people were used to seeing blacks have. They had been slaves, and that was kind of a natural progression into servant-type roles. And so some of the jobs that blacks first had on the railroads were really related to service jobs: waiters, cooks, people who were Pullman porters or chair car porters. And so we've have a lot of these pictures on display. A lot of them, frankly, from the Oregon Historical Society, very valuable in terms of helping us to put some pictures to the stories of these people and how they lived. Of course, with these people coming to Oregon then from various parts of the United States, a lot of that community then that grew out of those jobs was a community that grew up around Union Station. And so you might notice this is an older picture of Union Station. It doesn't have that train sign at the top. You might notice that. And so, in fact, one of the quotes in the exhibit was from a black woman who said that was one of the places that a black person could go and see black people in Portland was around Union Station, because so many of them worked on the railroad. In fact, by 1941, 98.6% of blacks in Portland were employed by the railroad. That's a high number. And so that gives you an idea of the influence of the railroad jobs. It's kind of too bad in a way that these are flashing by a little faster than I had imagined. But to put this in context, the other thing that was happening at the same time, particularly in the 20s, of course, was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in Oregon. And so if you come to that exhibit, you will see some pictures of Klan activity in Portland. You will see evidence of Jim Crow practices in Portland. Even though Portland likes to pride itself in saying that those things didn't happen here, in fact, they did happen here. And as I say to everyone when you're talking about history, history is the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's already happened. There's nothing you can do about it except tell the truth about it. And that's what we're trying to do in this exhibit, to tell the truth about the good, the bad, and the ugly of history. Out of that community that grew, we had a lot of firsts in the black community. The first black newspapers, new black churches grew up, entrepreneurs, businesses, civic clubs and organizations, social clubs. It was amazing to me when I started looking at some of the pictures that some of them Charlotte will talk about from her mother's collections that are at PSU, that really told you the lives of this whole very vibrant community that grew up in Portland at that time. And so I would just urge you to come and read through the pages, look through. We have a binder there of newspapers, and just to look through those pictures is amazing, and to see the life of this community that was going on at that time. And so what we would like to do tonight then is to have a couple of the people who both were on our advisory committee and who have been around Portland for a long time to talk with you about their personal experiences. The first is Senator Avell Gordley. Senator Gordley was the first African-American woman to be elected to the Oregon State Senate, representing the 23rd District from 1997 to 2009. Prior to her service as a senator, Gordley was a member of the Oregon House of Representatives from 1991 to 1996. A native of Portland, Gordley is the daughter of a Union Pacific Railroad Pullman porter
and a working mother who was active in women's organizations. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in the Administration of Justice from Portland State University and completed the program for senior executives at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. In 2002, Senator Gordley was the chief petitioner for a constitutional amendment that removed racist language from the Oregon Constitution. That's a whole story by itself. Other legislation she sponsored included creating the Governor's Environmental Justice Task Force and creating the statewide Office of Multicultural Health. And I could go on and on. I'm just going to kind of skip on down a little bit. Some of you probably know her better than I do. I have really met her personally as a part of this exhibit. And so it's been a real revelation to be in the presence of a person who's been so involved in so many things in the state. She currently serves as co-chair of the Multnomah County Oregon Historical Society Levy Oversight Committee and is a board member of Oregon Public Broadcasting. And so when she comes and speaks, she will be speaking to you as a daughter of the railroad. And so we'll want to hear all about what it was like to have been involved in those kinds of jobs at that point in time. The other panel member, who I'll introduce at this point, will be Charlotte Rutherford. Some of you probably know Charlotte. She's a second-generation Oregonian. Her dad was born here in 1911, but her family actually goes back beyond that. And I want to ask Charlotte to talk some about that too, how they came to Portland in the first place. She graduated from Portland Public Schools and Portland State University, moved to Washington, D.C., and earned a law degree from Howard University School of Law and an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center. She worked with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in Washington, D.C. and New York for almost 7 years before returning to Portland. She was a member of the District of Columbia Bar Association for more than 25 years and retired as an administrative law judge for the Office of Administrative Hearings, State of Oregon in 2010. This past year, she's been involved in retrieving and donating to Portland State University her mother's lifetime collections of documents, photographs, and personal items for use by historians and others interested in the history of African Americans in Portland. She's currently a board member of the Oregon Black Pioneers. And as I mentioned before, she was a member of our community advisory board for this exhibit. And so I say all that so that you will know that background, but now we want to hear from them. And so first I want to call Senator Gordley to come up and talk with us about what it was like to be a daughter of the railroad.
Thank you and good evening. Oh, come on. Where's Chappie? Chappie, are you still here? I need a little help. We do call and response, you know, in my cultural background. All right, all aboard. All aboard. All aboard. All right, all aboard. That's what this exhibit is about. A very rich history of arrival and community building, and it's a privilege and an honor and a pleasure to share a little bit about my family story this evening. And I've made some notes in my journal that I'm going to be reading from. And I know how I want to start, but I'm not quite sure how I'm going to end. So we'll just see. We'll see where this train takes us this evening. And I dedicate my remarks this evening to memory of my father, Fay Lee Gordley, my mother, Beatrice Bernice Coleman Gordley, my grandmothers, Leslie Gordley and Alberta Louise Coleman Dowell Randolph. My father left this plane 10 years ago this week. My mother made her journey to another plane 27 years ago. And I will tell you that after all this time, I still feel like an orphan in this peculiar paradise. So let's go forward. Walking from Portland to Chicago. My mother's family, the Coleman Dowells, last name, came to Oregon in the 1920s from Alabama and Texas in search of a better life, job opportunities. My father's family, the Gordleys, came to Oregon in 1936 from San Antonio, Texas. My dad's father, Isaac, and his people came from Barbados. Dad's father had come first to Portland and got work right away on the railroad, probably as a porter. He sent for my father and grandmother, Leslie, and then later Dad's younger brother would follow. Dad had picked cotton in Texas, and coming to Portland, he would find work on the Union Pacific Railroad as a Pullman porter. Grandmother Leslie, whose mother was English, there's so many stories within the story of family. Grandmother Leslie found work in the shipyards and as a domestic working in the homes of wealthy whites in southwest and northeast Portland. Dad's brother, Edison, known as Eddie, also came out to Portland, but he didn't fare well in the city. He kind of got caught up in some of the street life, and so he soon made his way back to Texas, where he joined the Army, died young, maybe from pneumonia or TB. We're not quite certain about how he came to his end. But Dad's father, again, my grandfather, Gordley, was the first one to come out and then send for Dad and Grandma. Now, Grandfather Gordley did not stay here long, and we're not sure why. We don't know that full story in the family. My father said about his work as a Pullman porter that he had walked from Portland to Chicago many times. In fact, he worked over 40 years from 1937 to the 70s before retiring with the Golden Spike as a kind of reward, so to speak. Always on his feet. He never missed a train, never missed a run. And over the years, his runs took him to Chicago, Pocatello, Idaho, Seattle. A shift was usually 36 hours, 6 days on, 3 days off, $1.25 an hour, plus tips. No pay until you made your return trip. Dad, this is one of my memories as a youngster, that Dad always had a pocket full of change. And I loved waiting for an opportunity to go dig in one of those pockets and take out some of the change so that I could go buy candy at Maxie's Better Buy grocery store, the black-owned grocery store up the street, which was owned by Donna Maxey's parents. Donna, you met earlier, she's the person who was coordinating race talks. So we're sister girls, sister friends, home girls, all of that. Okay. There's a connection here, is what I'm saying. Dad always had a pocket full of change. He carried a wad of $5 bills, and he also found other ways to earn extra money to take care of his family. He, for example, was an auxiliary policeman of Portland Police Department, which meant that he was involved in patrolling some of the Williams Avenue, Russell Street, Vancouver Avenue club district. And he and a few other railroad men had the privilege of having those jobs. There were 3 children in our family. My brother, sister, and I, all born at Emmanuel Hospital and delivered by Dr. Unthank. Some of you are familiar with Unthank Park in North Portland, which is adjacent to Self-Enhancement Incorporated. We're Unthank babies. My mother and father married very young after meeting in Portland. She was 17, all of 17. He was 20. They both loved to dance, and that's how they met at a social function. My son tells me that one thing he definitely learned from his grandfather, Gordley, and they were very close, is how to stand up to people and not tolerate racism. Dad said that, and I heard this expressed by my father as well. Dad said that there was a way to correct people and keep your dignity. So while white passengers on the train might call him boy, and that happened a lot, he'd straighten people out with the following: my name is Mr. Gordley. That's how you address me. Now, Dad and his close friend and fishing buddy, a fellow Pullman porter, O.D. Johnson, loved to go fishing and just hang out together. They had a wonderful friendship and relationship. And one of the stories my father told was of having met the president of the Union Pacific Railroad at one point. And this probably happened in somewhere in the early 50s. The president learned that Dad and O.D. loved to fish and asked them if they would bring him some salmon. And the story is that Dad and Mr. Johnson did in fact catch 3 salmon, and the president, UP president, who was in his special car, railroad car between Portland and Salem, got hold of the salmon from my dad. His private chef, the president's private chef, cooked one of the salmon. Another salmon was turned over to the regular kitchen, and then nobody knows what happened to the third salmon. That's part of that story. Don't mess with Texas. Don't mess with Texas. Dad would bring back the latest jazz and blues records from his Chicago runs. And the records, the music, was called the sounds of the time. And he'd share this music with Mr. Slaughter, who lived 2 doors down from us on North Williams Avenue. Mr. Slaughter owned a club. I think he had 2 clubs actually on North Russell Street. And Dad would also share the music with the folks who had a couple of record shops, other club owners. The sounds would be played at house parties, which he and Mom often hosted, and where they danced, played cards, and enjoyed their the company of their hardworking peers. They had a social life, in addition to working really hard. My sister, brother, and I share my father's collection of music, which he loved listening to. And in his later years, he would listen to that music, reminiscing in his den, and being visited by folks who had also run on the railroad with him. And I called this particular section of my notes, "Don't Mess with Texas," because in that den, my father had a sign on the wall that was from Texas that said, "Don't mess with Texas." And next to that was a poster with the Dallas Cowboys. And on the coffee table, there was a ball of cotton from Texas. My dad had picked cotton in Texas. There was the skin of a snake. My dad was called the Snake Man. That's another story. And that was his sanctuary. A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph was the black man's black man. He came to Portland at least 2 times, once in 1962, June 13th, 1962. And I want to read from an article in the Oregon Mirror newspaper, which published on Wednesday, June 13th, 1962, a story titled "National Labor Union Executive Visits the City." And this was significant because A. Philip Randolph was president of the International Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and vice president of the AFL-CIO. And he was in Portland to organize, and my father was part of the delegation that greeted him, and my father was probably part of the security detail that worked with Randolph while he was here. And I have the paper here if anyone is interested enough to want to come up and see it after Charlotte and I finish our talks. But let me read from the article because it's just so powerful, and it marks the moment. It marks the moment. A. Philip Randolph, Vice President of the American Federation of Labor and President of the International Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, visited the city for 3 days, June 9, 10, and 11th, to speak to labor union groups and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Speaking before a huge audience in the conference room at the Porters Club on North Williams Avenue, Mr. Randolph stated that his purpose for coming to Portland was to establish a Negro American Labor Council. The purpose of this organization will be to work towards eliminating segregation in unions and to obtain equal opportunities for Negroes who seek apprenticeship training on union jobs that are rejected because of racial origin. Mr. Randolph stated that Negro progress is moving too slow in this fast world of automation. And if parents don't start encouraging their children now towards acquiring education and seeking training in skilled crafts, they will be left out in the field of employment. Membership in the Negro American Labor Council is limited to union members, people seeking apprenticeship training through union jobs, and people seeking membership in labor unions that are turned away because of race. B. Johns of 4325 Northeast Rodney was appointed by Mr. Randolph to head the membership drive for the Portland branch. Mr. Johns is president of the Portland branch of the Sleeping Car Porters. The national office for the Negro American Labor Council is in New York City. Mr. Randolph is touring the United States, establishing branches of the Labor Council in all states. There are 25 branches of the Negro American Labor Council established throughout the U.S. so far, and Portland will make 26. Again, this was June 13th, 1962. A little bit about home life. My brother left home at age 17 with an uncle, my mother's brother. It was their desire to join the Air Force, and my brother would, in fact, do that, would serve in England, would later settle in New York, and then with the help of another uncle, my mom's eldest brother, would find work with the post office in New York and would stay settled there for many years before coming back to the Northwest. My sister and I grew up in a home where education was stressed. We could not come home with C grades. Dad was gone a lot on his railroad runs, but he always wanted to know the details of our school experiences, as reported by my mother and by my sister and I. And I can remember my mother going to the high school, which for me, my sister and I, was Girls Polytechnic High School, to demand that we be treated fairly, especially there was an occasion when I had the desire to take a business machines course and not commercial foods, which would be preparation to become a cook, which my counselor thought I should do. The point I'm making here is that my mother and my father were champions for our education. And I would later graduate from high school, go directly to work for Pacific Northwest Bell, the phone company, working as a records clerk for over 4 years. I would leave a management training position there to return to studies at Portland State University in 1971, again with strong encouragement to seek a higher education coming from my mother and my father. Now my dad, mom had not completed high school. My father had completed high school and had attended a high school named for a black woman, Phyllis Wheatley, the writer, poet, the high school in Texas, and he was always very proud about that association. After my father's death and funeral in 2003, I received a call from a woman who wanted to thank our family for taking her in 1949 after the Vanport flood. And at that time, we would have been living on North Flint Avenue, across from where Harriet Tubman School now stands. And the house that we lived in is long gone, but not the memories. And especially when I drive down that street, I'm flooded with memories. My mother handled the banking, the checkbook, the finances of the house. You know, once Dad turned over his check, Mom took care of the rest. She also worked part-time at Neighborhood Bill's, which was a black-owned grocery store owned by Bill Benton and his wife Teresa, located on North Williams Avenue and Tillamook Street, across from where the Elks Lodge is located now. Mom had earlier worked at a nightclub called the Dude Ranch, where famous black musicians coming through town would play. She also clerked in a drugstore. And I think it was important to my mother to have her own money, and that's why she worked part-time, although I don't think that was my dad's preference at all. Another memory about how our household worked, you have to understand this. The Pullman porters, they were always sharp. Another word would be, well, that was it. They were always sharp. The white shirts that they wore were crisp, starched. A part of our routine at home, my sister and I were responsible for making sure that those shirts got to Stewart's cleaners and back home. And sometimes we had responsibility for ironing the shirts, and I mean doing it perfectly. I just have a strong memory about those shirts. But also, and this is a statement that was true for all of those railroad men, they always dressed sharp when they were out of uniform, is what I'm saying. They had fine suits, shoes, hats. In fact, we buried my father with one of his favorite hats and the golden spike. Dad would also bring home to my mother from his runs on the railroad fine clothing and gifts. And I guess the point I'm making here is that personal appearance really mattered to that generation of black folk who were building community. Our family belonged to Mount Olivet Baptist Church. Mom was active in the Esther Circle. Dad did not attend regularly because, again, he was 6 days on, 3 days off, but he did pay his tithes regularly. Mom was active in the Esther Circle. She was a member of the Eastern Star and was honored with the title Grandworthy Matron in the 50s. She also belonged to the Oregon Association of Colored Women's Clubs, whose motto is "Lifting as we climb." And my grandmother Randolph was also a founder of the Harriet Tubman Club in the 20s, and that club still goes on to this day. And Mrs. Pauline Bradford serves as its current president. Grandmother Randolph was also co-chair of a campaign to eradicate tuberculosis from the black community of Albina in 1959. And just another example of how our family was engaged in community. Friends and family and friends meant a great deal to my parents. The house was always full with visitors. House parties were often. Some of my father's friends included Bill McClendon, who was a founder of the Black Studies Department at Reed College. Mr. McClendon was a journalist, a musician, a club owner. He was a Renaissance man of his time. And Mr. McClendon would later mentor me at the Urban League in my role as Director of Youth Services, working with the Urban League. And Mr. McClendon would come in and talk at length about community events, just as he did and had with my dad over the years. Judge Aaron Brown was another good family friend. He and Dad enjoyed lighting up their cigars and regaling one another with stories. And sometimes my sister and I would be sent up the block to Maxie's Better Buy Grocery to get Dad's favorite Roy Tan cigars. Dad loved fishing with his friends, his railroad friends. And sometimes he would take my son along, especially in my son's preteen years. They'd bring home a mess of fish, they'd clean them, with my mother's help, of course. They'd have a great fish fry and then give a good share of the fish away to friends and neighbors. Mom and Dad also had always kept a garden with greens, mustard greens, collards, turnips, tomatoes, green beans, onions, peppers. I'm saying all of that because I can still taste some of those wonderful meals shared around our table. And the abundance from the garden was always shared with the neighborhood as well. Dad loved Sunday drives. With Mom, my sister and I, he loved the drive to Multnomah Falls, especially. And music was the soundtrack in our home. From 5 a.m. forward, when my father was home, we would hear the music, jazz, blues, the best sounds. And again, Dad loved to share the music with all of us and with all of his friends and with the community. As I move toward closing, I'll just share with you that my parents became homeowners in 1949, which I was 2. My sister was born that year. My brother was would have been 11. And the house they purchased was at 4511 North Williams Avenue. But there's a backstory there because the area was redlined to keep out black folks. And so Dad had a friend who was Jewish who bought the property and turned it over to Mom and Dad. And it's not an uncommon story for that time. And my sister and brother and I still own the home. In spite of the gentrification that we witness all up and down Williams Avenue, we still hold on to that property. And I put it that way because before my father passed, he used to get phone calls, visits, mail from speculators, people who wanted to get hold of the property. In fact, my father, in his last illness, when he was in the hospital, Emmanuel Hospital, told us that 2 white people came to his bedside one evening and asked him if he wanted to sell his property. That is the way some of the speculators work, shamefully. So let me end in this way. I said I wasn't quite sure how I would end, and I'm very aware that there's a lot of emotion in my voice this evening, and the emotion has everything to do with this being the 10th anniversary of my father's passing. The 28th of February would be the 10th year. And I just want to say to you that my generation, and I'm in my 66th year, we had so much poured into us, that gave us the courage, the strength, the ability to take our turn at lifting as we climb. And so I stand here on the shoulders of certainly of my parents and my family, but also of that generation that left the South, went north, some somehow made their way to the Pacific Northwest, and they left the familiar, and they left not knowing what they were going to find once they arrived. And so they left with a lot of courage in their hearts, and they left, and they came, and they became those community builders. And so again, I just want to honor my mother, my father, my grandparents, everybody who lived on the street where I grew up, North Williams Avenue, the Maxis, the Malrays, the Baltzagers, all of those families that had their hands on all of us, and again, who poured into us and made it possible for me to stand here this evening and share my little story with you. Thank you for coming out.
Don't everybody leave. Like so? All right. Well, where do we go from there? First of all, I have to tell you, Abel and I were in grade school together. So she's divulged how old she is. So that's how long I've known her. We went to Highland, as it was then called. My dad went to Highland, as it was then called. My grandfather came here, my dad's father, in about 1895. He was recruited to come along with what turned out to be 65 other black men to work at what was then called the Portland Hotel. Because of Oregon's exclusionary laws, there were very few black people here, and none of them were employed. They had businesses if they made money. They were not working for anyone. And the people who owned the Portland Hotel decided that black people gave the best service, but there were no black service workers. So they enlisted the help of one black man who happened to be a service worker, but not even from Portland, but was here. And he went back to his hometown of Columbia, South Carolina, and recruited men to come here and work at that hotel. My grandfather and his brother, you wouldn't know who, but my grandfather was in two of those pictures that were being shown of the railroad exhibit. My grandfather and his brother were barbers. They were barbers at the hotel. They were what were called room barbers. They went to the room to cut people's hair. And eventually they struck out on their own and had a barbershop near Union Station. But as a result of the Depression and nickel haircuts and dime shaves and a little bit of money they were making, they were forced out of business and ended up running on the road. My grandfather was a barber on the road, and my dad was a waiter on the road in the 30s and the 40s. I wasn't born until the end of the 40s, and he had stopped running on the road by the time I'm aware of what's going on in his life. As a matter of fact, because of the flood and the influx of black folk who had come here to work in the war industry moving into town, there was a major effort to find a way to open jobs for black folks in Portland. And as a result of that effort, in the early 50s, my dad became a knitter with DN Knitting Company.
Dean made and still does make Letterman jackets and sweaters for schools. And so my consciousness is of my dad working as a knitter for Dean Knitting Company for the next 20 years until he helped organize a union there and they forced him out. But that's a different story. What I do recall about what he would say about the railroad throughout my life, I don't remember anything about my grandfather in the railroad because he died when I was 8, but I do remember quite a few things that my dad had to say, and there weren't very many of them that were good. He actually hated his job as a waiter on the road. He hated the indignity that the men had to endure if they wanted a tip because they were dependent upon their tips. They were underpaid for their work and deliberately underpaid so that they would be even more ingratiating to the customers and hopefully earn a dime more. It got so bad, my daughter and I were talking about this, about my coming here to speak to you, and she remembered her grandfather talking about hating his job so much that he would throw up when he knew he had to go out. He was out 5 and I think in 5, if my memory serves me. I know he was definitely out 5. And I also remember that because of World War II, and I think it was during that period that he really wanted to quit his job. He could not because the railroad was considered an essential war effort and people were frozen on their jobs. You couldn't quit, you couldn't leave, you couldn't change your job. And that caught my dad. He also used to talk about hot beds in Chicago, that you didn't rent a room for the night on your layovers, you rented a bed, and somebody probably just got out of it to go back to work themselves. And so you slept in a hot bed, literally. He didn't like that either, needless to say. I think the thing that stuck with me the most, though, was you practically had to train a gun on my dad to make him eat in a restaurant. After the years of seeing how I think some of his co-workers responded to mistreatment, and having grown up with "We cater to white trade only" signs here in Portland, I don't think he was ever very sure about the cleanliness of the food he would get in a restaurant, and really did not want to eat in white restaurants anyway, because I don't think he trusted what folks could or would do, having seen what some of his co-workers did do. I mean, they couldn't say anything, but some of them did get back in their own ways. And knowing that, I think it was, I think it stuck with him. Even though he hated his job, I'm sure he loved the men, because he was very actively involved in the retired railroad group of men. He went to their annual dinners every year, got lots of pictures. Pictures, let me mention pictures right quickly. Gwen mentioned my mom's collection. My mom and dad, since my dad was born here, obviously he knew everybody, because at that time there weren't that many black people to know. My mother's people came through Portland, but settled in what was called Marshfield, and is now called Coos Bay, in 1913. They came here from Oklahoma. Mom and Dad married in 1936, and they lived in the house my dad had grown up in. So that means there were things in that house that predated my mother, things that had belonged to my grandparents, things like newspapers, old newspapers that predated her. And my mom collected newspapers as well as articles that had to do with black folk, and photographs and letters and copies of letters that she wrote for the organizations that she belonged to. She was everybody's secretary. She was Dr. Unthank's secretary, as Yvelle mentioned Dr. Unthank, and he delivered my child. He didn't deliver me, but he did deliver my child. And Mom worked for him for about 20 years as a medical secretary, which she taught herself how to be. She knew how to type, she knew how to take shorthand, but she didn't know medical terminology. And he would dictate his notes, and she would type the record notes from a visit into the records of patients using a medical dictionary to teach herself how to do medical transcription. When Mom and Dad moved out of their house and I cleaned it out, I found over 100 boxes of stuff that Mom had saved. Some of it I'd seen before, most of it I had no idea what it was, but it was paper and she saved it. So when I cleaned their house out, I took all those boxes to my house and made a path through my basement with them. Fast forward 10 or 11 years, and thanks to Avell again, I was introduced to Patricia Schechter, who's a history professor at Portland State. And in conversation, these boxes came up because I had been trying to find a home for those boxes. And Patricia volunteered to use a class that she was going to be teaching in archival methods on these documents. And to make a long story short, as it's turned out, the library at Portland State, the Special Collections Division, asked for the documents to keep and has now acquired my mom's collection of both personal and professional memorabilia. There are photographs, some of the photographs that you saw here and some of the photographs that you will see at the railroad exhibit are among my mother's collection. There are 4 generations of correspondence from her mother, her siblings, my generation, my 2 brothers and I, and then our children, that she saved every letter, every card, every note. And it has become, and will, I think, in the years ahead, be one of the most valuable collections for Oregon, or Portland specifically, Black history, because it contains newspapers that aren't commonly in collections around town. There's microfiche of some of those newspapers, but not the actual paper. And I'm really pleased that the Riddell Burdine and Otto G. Rutherford family collection is housed now at Portland State, and if any of you, it's open to the public. All you have to do is let the people in the Special Collections Division know you want to come. And I think you'll be amazed at the breadth of information in the collection. Portland State did its own excerpts from the collection in an exhibit, and we'll be putting that exhibit online soon. I'm not really sure when, but I do believe they're taking it down this month and plan as they take it down to scan everything. So if you're interested, check out Portland State's website, and eventually the Rutherford Collection exhibit will be a part of it. As I mentioned, Dad was dedicated to the retired men and continued to stay involved. Some of you may have gone to the talk that was at the June Key building Sunday before last, where the elders spoke. One of those elders was Minnie Bell Johnson. And Miss Johnson, her husband was a waiter also. And she and I made a trip. She took me to St. Louis when I was about 13. And I swear, they fed us the entire way. One thing you have to say about the men who worked on the road, and that is they took care of their own. And in those days, you had linen and china and silver, and a real chef with real food. And I mean, it was wonderful. It really was. Even though the job may have been especially hard for the men, and in the early years even worse, they, like I said, they took care of their own. I have a memory of a few years later. I was about 18, and another friend of mine, a young woman of the same age, her dad had also been a waiter in earlier years, and the two of us took the train to Seattle. Now, mind you, we're 18. So we couldn't get out of the dining car. We ate and talked and ate and talked. The guys were just especially kind to us. They enjoyed our company too, I think. Abel used the word sharp. I would use the word dapper. I don't know if anybody ever saw my dad in a pair of tennis shoes or a pair of jeans, unless he was working in the yard. That was it. He was changing his clothes and putting on a jacket and a hat to go to the store or the liquor store or anywhere. They were not going to be seen on the street and not be dressed. I don't know how much of that had to do with the times where everything and everybody was more formal, or the times where we're still trying to be recognized as real people without the remnants of slavery hanging over us. But I do know they don't make them like that anymore. Those men had a kind of courage in the face of adversity that they faced on a regular basis that I don't think our young men today could even begin to understand, let alone try to emulate. My dad died in 2000 at the age of 89. My mom in 2001 at the age of 88. Those of you who may have seen the documentary Local Color, my dad talks a lot throughout that documentary. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It's a good primer on Oregon's Black history up through 1990, which is when it was made. My parents gave a lot to this community, both in real time and in spiritual connection. They worked for their community. They worked to improve their community. And we, my generation, reaped the benefits of their hard work. As far as Dad and the railroad goes, I think that about concludes my talk. Thank you.
We have a little time for some questions and responses and what have you, so I'm going to throw it open a little bit and ask our panelists to be available to answer questions, comments. Anyone? Not sure how this is done because we don't have microphones out there, so you'll have to stand and talk very loud. Okay, Donna?
You didn't talk about it very much, but could you address the spiritual aspect of your families and the role that spirituality played in what they did in the community and in being here in Oregon, and how that played out in your life?
Okay, the question had to do with the role of spirituality in the church in terms of these families. So would you like to address that?
I believe I mentioned briefly that my family belonged to Mount Olivet Baptist Church. My mother was active in the Esther Circle at the church named after Queen Esther in the Bible. My grandmother was a mother of the church, Mother Randolph of Mount Olivet Baptist Church. And I think I mentioned that my father, while he wasn't a regular attender at church, he paid his tithes regularly. And Mom was also a member of the Eastern Star. And in that role, was honored to be appointed Grand Worthy Matron 1 year in the 50s. Church was very, church life was very important to our family, especially to my mother and my grandmothers. Again, their work was grounded in the church and their roles in the church community. My grandmother on my father's side had been a member of Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church before she passed in 1959, and again was very active in that congregation.
Well, you got religion and then you got spirituality. I went to, my family was connected to Bethel AME Church, and that was my social life, really, as a teenager. But I think when I use the word spiritual, I don't necessarily mean going to church religious. I mean, my folks did that too, although I have to admit in later years, they didn't do it as much. I don't know if they were doing it for me when they were doing it in their younger years or not, but it seemed like the older they got, the less active they were in their church. They still considered themselves members, they still got mailings, they still sent money, but they didn't participate that much. And my mom had been the church secretary for a while. But they had a belief in their community. They had a commitment, I guess that's a better word, to their community. They knew infinitely more people than I do. They were in every group that came and went, a member of every group. They were constantly being called upon to participate in something. And I know that as their generation left this plane, my dad was everybody's pallbearer. In fact, I remember I wasn't living here when they were in their 70s and things started stepping up. And I remember my mom talking about Dad going and being at another funeral and another funeral and another funeral, to the point where she finally was like, he can't carry these caskets anymore. They're going to have to get some younger men, you know. But he was committed, and he knew, and like I said earlier, he grew up at a time when black people in this town were in the hundreds, and then eventually the low thousands, like 2,000. So it didn't take long to talk to my dad, and he could know who your father and where you lived and what they did if you'd been here any length of time at all. And I think because the black community was so small and so under siege with the Klan, you saw the Klan with the mayor and whatever, that picture we saw, in his formative years, that I think his response might have been different if he had moved here later in life. But he grew up at the worst of times. I mean, he talked about being called a nigger every day and fighting every day when he was a kid. We lived on 9th and Shaver. He lived on 9th and Shaver. Mind you, I said, maybe I didn't say that. What I said was they got married and moved into the house my dad was raised in. Well, they didn't leave that house. I grew up in that same house too. The neighborhood was completely white up until I was about 4 or 5, which would put you into the 50s. So from 1911, when he was born, and he was the third in his family, until the Vanport flood and I-5 and the Coliseum, which is what moved black people into our neighborhood on 9th and Shaver. The earlier years, no, they were down where the Coliseum, in fact, the Coliseum took out Bethel Church. So I think because he grew up at a time when things were so hostile and there were so few black folk, that there was a more tightly knit community that relied on each other and depended on each other a whole lot more than occurred as years went on and the community grew. And I think it's that kind of commitment that I referred to as a spiritual connection.
couple of things. In our exhibit, we call that whole church area the heart and soul, because during that time period, Charlotte is right, a lot happened at those churches. It became not only a center for religious and spiritual activity, but also civic activity. It was a meeting place where plans were being laid to fight for, equal rights. It's where, like the NAACP, the beginnings of the NAACP in Portland were, that was a part of that process back in the early 1900s. And so it really was, in those days, a real center of that black community in Portland. The other thing I would say, too, is that in doing this exhibit, we quickly realized that there are probably 3 or 4 exhibits within this exhibit. We could have easily talked about the whole housing issue in Portland and the resettlement. That would have been an exhibit all its own. We could have easily talked about just the Klan activity and the whole, we call it a legacy of discrimination in Oregon. We could have done a whole exhibit on that. So there's a lot of information, a lot of rich exhibits to be had around this whole subject. Okay, I think you were next.
I did. The railroads had a lot to do with creating a middle class economic status for the black community. Coming here to Portland, being such a real minority by the population, you had made reference to your father always having cash, change, $5 bills. In their era, that was a lot of money. But that also, your opinion as to whether that set a precedence in which they could earn a certain living, in which they could acquire property, clothing, have a lifestyle that was setting a standard for the black community?
Hey, did everyone hear that? The question had to do with those jobs as creating a middle class. We heard both the speakers talk about the jobs that enable